The spring sun poured warm gold across Ashcombe Manor, turning its ancient stone walls into glowing towers that seemed untouched by sorrow. Carriages rolled through the wrought iron gates one after another, polished wheels crunching softly over pale gravel while liveried footmen hurried to welcome England's finest families. Inside, crystal chandeliers blazed with hundreds of candles, although daylight still lingered beyond the towering windows. Fresh white roses climbed marble columns, musicians tuned delicate violins beneath painted ceilings, and servants moved with disciplined precision to prepare for the annual spring charity ball, the most celebrated evening in the county. To every guest arriving in embroidered silk and polished boots, Ashcombe Manor appeared as magnificent as ever. Only those who lived beneath its roof understood that splendor often concealed the deepest loneliness. Duke Adrian Ashcombe stood at the top of the grand staircase, dressed in immaculate black evening attire that reflected neither joy nor anticipation. At 38, he possessed the commanding presence expected of one of England's most respected noblemen, yet the warmth that had once softened his grey eyes had disappeared years ago beside his late wife's deathbed. Since losing Duchess Catherine, he had buried himself in duty while quietly convincing himself that affection was always temporary and kindness always carried a hidden price. Every governess, companion, and caretaker who had entered the manor had eventually disappointed him. Some sought wealth. Others pursued influence. None had remained for the children alone. His grief had slowly transformed into suspicion, and suspicion had hardened into cruelty so subtle that even he no longer recognized it. Standing several steps below him was Miss Eleanor Whitmore, 26 years old, newly appointed as governess only 3 weeks earlier. Her cream-colored gown was elegant in its simplicity, her chestnut curls gathered neatly beneath a modest bonnet trimmed with ivory ribbon. She carried herself with quiet dignity despite knowing she occupied the lowest place among the distinguished guests filling the ballroom. She had already earned the affection of Adrian's 3 children through patience rather than authority. 12-year-old Edmund admired her calm intelligence. 9-year-old Clara laughed again because of the stories Eleanor invented before bedtime. Little Henry, only 6, had stopped waking from nightmares whenever she sat beside him until dawn. She never demanded gratitude. She simply offered kindness wherever she found fear. As the orchestra began its opening melody, Adrian raised a crystal glass to welcome the assembled nobles. His speech praised generosity, charity, and noble responsibility until his gaze settled upon Eleanor. An almost invisible hardness crossed his face. "Allow me," he announced smoothly, "to introduce the newest employee of Ashcombe Manor. Miss Whitmore has been hired only temporarily, for experience has taught me that ordinary women rarely remain devoted once greater opportunities appear. My children are fond of her already, but I advise them not to become attached. Temporary help should never mistake duty for belonging." Silence swept through the ballroom. Several guests exchanged embarrassed glances. Others smiled politely, unwilling to challenge their host. Eleanor lowered her eyes, refusing to defend herself. Only the children reacted openly. Clara's small face crumpled with confusion while Henry reached instinctively for Eleanor's hand. Edmund looked toward his father with quiet disappointment that stung far more deeply than anger could have. Yet Eleanor gently squeezed Henry's fingers and whispered that everything was all right, sparing Adrian from the very humiliation he had inflicted upon her. The celebration continued, but the music no longer sounded joyful. Throughout dinner Eleanor remained beside the children, encouraging them to eat although she herself barely touched her meal. Adrian observed from across the hall, convinced her composure was carefully rehearsed. In his mind, genuine devotion simply did not survive hardship. Sooner or later every smiling face revealed another ambition. He believed time always exposed truth. Unfortunately, his certainty had become stronger than compassion. Near midnight, as guests prepared for the evening's first grand waltz, Adrian descended the marble staircase. His hand tightened briefly against the polished banister. The room blurred before his eyes. Gasps echoed as the Duke staggered forward, collapsed onto the gleaming floor, and lay frighteningly still beneath the crystal chandeliers. Ladies screamed. Musicians dropped their instruments. The children rushed toward him, crying desperately while servants summoned the family physician. Dr. Aldridge examined the Duke with grave concentration before rising slowly to address the horrified gathering. His voice carried solemn authority as he announced that the Duke had suffered a sudden neurological collapse and fallen into a deep coma. No one could predict whether he would awaken. The ballroom dissolved into fearful whispers. Some guests quietly departed before dawn. Others offered polished condolences that sounded strangely rehearsed. The children refused to leave their father's side, clinging to hope through exhausted tears, while Eleanor remained beside them with unwavering calm, gently comforting each child until morning light crept through the windows. Before sunrise the manor had already begun changing. Servants whispered behind closed doors, distant relatives sent hurried messages requesting visits, and familiar faces suddenly wore expressions of careful calculation instead of concern. Hidden beneath closed eyelids, Adrian heard every word without moving a single muscle. His impossible deception had begun exactly as planned. He waited confidently for Eleanor's kindness to disappear like everyone else's. Instead, long after the corridors fell silent, she knelt beside his bed, brushed a loose strand of hair from his forehead, and whispered through trembling tears, "Catherine, I promised I would never abandon them." Morning settled over Ashcombe Manor beneath a gray sky that seemed to mourn alongside the family. The joyful echoes of the spring charity ball had vanished, replaced by muffled footsteps, whispered conversations, and doors that closed more softly than before. Heavy curtains remained drawn around the Duke's chamber, where candlelight flickered day and night beside the motionless figure lying upon the great carved bed. Every hour physicians checked his pulse, servants carried fresh linens, and the children quietly entered in turns, hoping to see the slightest movement in their father's hand. None came. Hidden beneath closed eyelids, Adrian heard every prayer, every sigh, and every secret spoken by those who believed he would never awaken again. 3 days after his collapse, Lady Beatrice Ashcombe arrived in an elegant black carriage trimmed with silver. Tall, impeccably dressed, and carrying herself with polished confidence, she embraced the grieving children before offering graceful condolences that sounded almost too perfect. She announced she would remain indefinitely to oversee the household until the Duke either recovered or passed away. Most servants bowed gratefully, believing another noble presence would bring stability. Eleanor noticed something different. Behind Lady Beatrice's gentle smile rested calculating eyes that studied every corridor, every servant, and every frightened child as though measuring possessions rather than offering comfort. Changes began almost immediately. Household expenses were suddenly reduced. The finest meals disappeared from the servants' dining hall. Fresh flowers stopped arriving. Several elderly servants learned their wages had been suspended until further notice. The nursery fire burned lower each evening because coal was considered too expensive. When Eleanor quietly questioned the steward, he lowered his head and admitted the new instructions had come directly from Lady Beatrice. Temporary economies, she called them. Everyone else called them necessity. Only Eleanor recognized them as deliberate cruelty disguised as responsibility. Her own circumstances worsened quietly. The comfortable chamber prepared for the governess was reassigned to Lady Beatrice's personal maid. Eleanor was moved into a narrow attic room where cold drafts slipped through cracked stone walls each night. Her wardrobe was reduced to 2 plain dresses after another servant claimed the rest had been mistakenly packed away. Even the morning tea that normally accompanied lessons with the children disappeared without explanation. Yet whenever anyone apologized, Eleanor simply smiled and assured them she needed very little to remain grateful. Adrian listened from his bed as doors opened and closed around him. He expected resentment. He waited for complaints. Instead he heard Eleanor thanking the maids who brought her simple meals and encouraging embarrassed footmen not to blame themselves for decisions beyond their control. Each gentle response unsettled him more than open defiance ever could. The woman he believed would reveal selfish ambition under pressure seemed to grow only kinder the greater her hardships became. The children noticed every change. Edmund found Eleanor carrying extra blankets upstairs herself because no servant wished to burden her further. Clara secretly left wildflowers outside Eleanor's attic door each morning. Little Henry insisted on sharing his biscuits whenever he believed she had skipped another meal. Rather than accepting pity, Eleanor turned every small kindness into a lesson about generosity, telling them that love multiplied whenever it was shared instead of protected. Evenings became the brightest moments inside the darkened manor. After checking on the Duke together, Eleanor gathered the children in the old schoolroom beside a crackling fireplace. She transformed arithmetic into treasure hunts, history into adventures, and music lessons into games that filled empty corridors with hesitant laughter. She mended torn dolls with delicate stitches, repaired Edmund's broken toy ship using scraps from discarded furniture, and patiently taught Henry to read from the worn adventure books their mother had once loved. For a few precious hours each day, grief loosened its grip upon 3 wounded hearts. Lady Beatrice watched these moments with growing irritation. She had expected the children to become dependent upon her authority. Instead they sought Eleanor whenever fear returned. Unable to win their affection honestly, she chose another path. One afternoon she entered the nursery carrying expensive sweets and elegant ribbons. Speaking softly enough to sound compassionate, she told the children that governesses always accepted better positions once wealthy employers died. "When your dear father is gone," she murmured sadly, "Miss Whitmore will naturally leave to begin another life. Such is the way of employment." Clara's face drained of color. Henry stared silently at the floor. Only Edmund questioned her. But she promised she would stay. Lady Beatrice sighed with practiced sorrow. "Promises rarely survive reality, my dear." Those words lingered long after she departed. That night the children followed Eleanor from room to room with unusual silence. She sensed their fear before anyone spoke. As she tucked Henry beneath warm blankets, he suddenly grasped her sleeve with trembling fingers. "Will you disappear when Papa dies?" The innocent question seemed to stop time itself. Eleanor knelt beside the bed until she looked directly into all three anxious faces. "I cannot promise what tomorrow holds," she said gently, "but I can promise that I will never choose to abandon you. As long as God grants me strength, you will never face your sorrow alone." The children threw their arms around her. Behind the chamber door, an elderly maid quietly wiped tears from her cheeks. Later that same evening, Eleanor entered the servants' hall carrying a small velvet pouch. Without ceremony she placed several gold sovereigns into the steward's hands and instructed him to restore the unpaid wages of the oldest servants before morning. The steward stared in astonishment. "Miss Whitmore, this is far too much." She smiled softly. "It belonged to my mother before it belonged to me." Only after she left did he open the pouch completely and discover the necklace was gone. The heirloom had been sold. Its price had purchased bread, medicine, and dignity for people who could never repay her. Hidden behind motionless eyelids upstairs, Adrian heard every whispered explanation from the grateful steward. Shame settled heavily upon his heart as he realized the woman he had publicly dismissed possessed a nobility no title could bestow. Yet before dawn another conversation drifted through the silent corridors. Returning from the library, Edmund accidentally stopped outside Lady Beatrice's sitting room and heard her calm voice speaking to her solicitor. "Once Adrian is buried," she said without hesitation, "the children will obey me, and Miss Whitmore will be sent away before they become impossible to separate." The words Edmund overheard echoed through Ashcombe Manor long after dawn broke across the estate. He told no one what Lady Beatrice had said, carrying the terrible secret alone because he feared speaking it aloud might somehow make it true. He watched Eleanor move quietly through the corridors, smiling at servants, comforting Henry after another nightmare, and encouraging Clara to practice the piano their mother had once loved. Every gentle moment became painful because he believed each one might soon be the last. Hidden within the Duke's darkened chamber, Adrian heard the unusual silence in his eldest son's footsteps and recognized a burden had settled upon the boy's young shoulders. Dr. Aldridge noticed it as well. The old physician had served the Ashcombe family for over 30 years. He had delivered Adrian into the world, stood beside Catherine on her wedding day, and remained at her bedside until her final breath. More than anyone else, he understood that the deception surrounding the Duke's false coma had begun revealing truths Adrian was scarcely prepared to face. Yet one truth remained hidden too long. Locked inside his study rested a small oak box that Catherine had entrusted to him before she died, instructing him to guard its contents until the proper moment arrived. That moment had finally come. Late one rainy afternoon, after Eleanor finished reading to the children, Dr. Aldridge quietly asked her to accompany him to the manor library. Shelves climbed toward the painted ceiling, filled with generations of Ashcombe history, while rain tapped softly against tall windows overlooking the gardens. Without explanation, the physician unlocked the weathered oak box and removed a cream-colored envelope sealed with faded crimson wax. Across the front, written in graceful handwriting Adrian would have recognized instantly, appeared only two words: "For Eleanor." The young governess froze. Her trembling fingers hovered above the letter without touching it. "I never understood why Her Grace entrusted this to me," Dr. Aldridge said gently. "She told me you would know when your heart became too weary to continue. Looking at you now, I believe that day has arrived." He quietly left the library, closing the heavy door behind him. Only the crackling fireplace disturbed the silence. Hidden several rooms away, Adrian heard the library door open through the old ventilation passage connecting the manor's private chambers. Unable to move, he listened as every rustle of paper carried toward him with startling clarity. His pulse quickened despite his perfectly motionless body. Eleanor finally broke the ancient seal. A faint scent of dried lavender escaped from the folded pages, carrying with it memories carefully preserved across 7 long years. Before reading another line, tears slipped silently down her cheeks. The words transported her into another spring, another road, another life. 7 years earlier she had been a village schoolteacher returning home after visiting her widowed father. Rain had poured relentlessly across narrow country lanes while thunder rolled over distant hills. Near a sharp bend she discovered an overturned carriage lying half submerged inside a swollen stream. Frightened horses struggled against tangled harnesses, shattered wheels floated beside broken trunks, and cries for help barely rose above the rushing water. Without hesitation she climbed into the freezing current. Ignoring broken glass and dangerous debris, she forced open the damaged carriage door. Inside she found Duchess Catherine Ashcombe trapped beneath collapsed wood, bleeding heavily but shielding something beneath her cloak. She was protecting the small bundle she carried. It was 6-month-old Henry. Eleanor lifted the child first, placing him safely upon the muddy bank before returning through the icy water. Though exhausted and injured herself, she remained beside Catherine until nearby farmers arrived with ropes and blankets. Throughout the long night she never left the Duchess alone, even refusing food until physicians confirmed both mother and child would survive. Their lives became forever intertwined from that single act of courage. Over the following years Catherine often invited Eleanor to Ashcombe Manor under the simple excuse of discussing village schools and charitable projects. Yet beneath those conversations grew a sincere friendship untouched by differences in birth or title. Catherine admired Eleanor's quiet strength, while Eleanor found herself inspired by a duchess who believed compassion mattered more than privilege. Together they visited orphanages, organized reading circles for servants' children, and carried baskets of food to struggling families without announcing their generosity to society. Adrian rarely witnessed those visits. His political duties frequently carried him away from home, leaving Catherine to pursue her charitable work independently. Eleanor never expected recognition. She simply treasured the friendship. Then illness entered Ashcombe Manor without warning. What began as a persistent fever slowly stole Catherine's strength despite every physician's effort. During those heartbreaking final weeks, Eleanor visited almost daily, reading aloud beside the bed whenever exhaustion prevented the Duchess from speaking. One quiet evening after the children had fallen asleep, Catherine dismissed every servant except Eleanor. "I need one promise," she whispered weakly. Eleanor immediately took her hand. "If my children ever become lonely, love them until they smile again." She shook her head through tears. "You must ask your husband." Catherine smiled sadly. "My husband loves them deeply, but grief changes people. If sorrow ever hardens his heart, they will need someone who remembers the man he used to be." Eleanor could no longer speak. She simply nodded. The Duchess slipped a small silver key into her palm. "It opens nothing inside this house," Catherine murmured. "It opens your promise. One day you will understand." Those became the last private words they ever shared. The memory faded as Eleanor lowered the letter into her lap, tears falling freely into the firelight. Catherine's final page contained only one sentence written with increasingly fragile handwriting. "You were never chosen because you are perfect. You were chosen because my children always smiled first when they saw you." In the neighboring chamber, Adrian felt something inside him finally break. Every suspicion he had nurtured for 7 bitter years suddenly appeared shamefully small. Eleanor had never entered Ashcombe Manor seeking his fortune, admiration, or affection. She had fulfilled a dying mother's final request with unwavering faith while enduring humiliation from the very man she had quietly promised to help. His throat tightened with silent remorse as memories of his cruel words returned one after another. Before he could gather his shattered thoughts, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. A terrified maid burst into the library, breathless with panic, crying that smoke had been spotted rising from the abandoned nursery wing after lightning struck the western tower. The first crack of thunder rolled across Ashcombe Manor like the sound of ancient stones splitting apart. Rain hammered the slate rooftops with relentless force, while fierce winds bent the old oaks until their branches scraped violently against towering windows. Servants hurried through dim corridors securing shutters, gathering frightened children, and carrying lanterns whose flames trembled with every icy draft. Outside, lightning flashed again, bathing the estate in ghostly white before plunging everything back into darkness. Hidden behind closed eyelids, Adrian sensed the unusual panic spreading through the household long before frightened voices reached his chamber. Then came the smell. Smoke. At first it drifted faintly beneath his bedroom door, mingling with candle wax and rain-soaked wood. Moments later hurried footsteps thundered along the corridor, followed by desperate cries echoing through the manor. "Fire! The west nursery! Bring water!" Adrian's pulse pounded against his ribs, yet he forced himself to remain perfectly still. Every instinct urged him to leap from the bed, but weeks of deception chained him to his own cruel decision. He listened helplessly as servants raced past his chamber carrying buckets, blankets, and axes. Eleanor reached the hallway at the same moment as Dr. Aldrich. Smoke curled from beneath the nursery door upstairs, growing thicker with every passing heartbeat. Flames licked hungrily across ancient wooden beams after lightning had shattered part of the western roof. Servants formed hurried lines with buckets while footmen struggled to force open swollen doors. The children stood together near the staircase, their frightened faces glowing orange beneath the spreading firelight. "Where is Henry?" Eleanor suddenly asked. Silence answered her. Clara looked around wildly. Edmund's expression turned pale. "He went back," Edmund whispered. "He forgot Mother's music box." Before anyone could stop him, Eleanor was already running. Lady Beatrice grabbed her arm. "Don't be foolish. The roof could collapse." Eleanor gently pulled free. "A child is still inside." She climbed the staircase without another word. The smoke thickened with every step. Burning embers drifted through shattered windows. Heat pressed against her face until breathing itself became painful. Behind her, terrified servants shouted for her to return. She never looked back. Inside the abandoned nursery, flames devoured curtains once embroidered by Duchess Catherine herself. Toys lay scattered across the floor while smoke hid the walls behind a suffocating gray veil. Henry crouched beneath an overturned table, clutching a small wooden music box tightly against his chest. Tears streaked his soot-covered cheeks as coughing shook his tiny body. "Eleanor, I'm here." Her voice remained astonishingly calm. She wrapped a damp blanket around the frightened boy before lifting him into her arms. One heavy beam crashed behind them, sending sparks exploding across the room. The doorway they had entered disappeared beneath burning timber. Another way. There had to be another way. Shielding Henry beneath her body, Eleanor stumbled toward the old balcony doors overlooking the rear gardens. They refused to open. She pulled again. Nothing. A nearby window shattered from the heat. Cold rain burst into the room alongside fierce winds that momentarily pushed the smoke aside. Using every ounce of strength remaining, Eleanor struck the balcony doors with an iron poker until the lock finally splintered apart. Fresh air rushed inside. Below, servants stretched blankets across the courtyard while Dr. Aldrich shouted instructions through the storm. "There. Jump." The balcony groaned beneath growing flames. Eleanor wrapped both arms around Henry. "You must hold on to me as tightly as you can." "I'm scared." "So am I." She kissed his forehead. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing love anyway. The burning balcony suddenly cracked. Without another second to think, Eleanor leaped. The waiting servants caught Henry safely. Eleanor struck the edge of the blanket awkwardly before rolling across rain-soaked stones. Pain exploded through her shoulder as smoke filled her lungs. She tried to rise but collapsed immediately. The courtyard erupted with relieved cries. Henry clung desperately to Edmund and Clara, still refusing to release Catherine's music box. Lady Beatrice hurried forward, not toward Eleanor but toward the children. "Come away at once." Edmund stepped backward. "No. You belong with your family." "We already are." His answer silenced everyone. Dr. Aldrich knelt beside Eleanor. Her breathing had become dangerously shallow. Her pulse weakened beneath soot-blackened fingertips. "Carry her inside." The physician's voice remained steady, but fear shadowed every word. As servants lifted Eleanor carefully, Adrian heard everything through the open chamber door. He heard Henry sobbing. He heard Clara begging someone to save Eleanor. He heard Edmund blaming himself for allowing his younger brother upstairs alone. Each voice pierced the walls he had built around his heart. Still he remained motionless. Still he pretended. The deception that had once seemed wise now felt monstrous. Eleanor was placed upon a bed in the adjoining chamber. Physicians hurried between rooms carrying medicines and clean bandages. The children refused to leave. They gathered around her exactly as they had gathered around their father for weeks. Henry reached carefully toward her burned hand. "Please wake up." She did not move. Clara rested her forehead against the blanket, crying quietly. Edmund stood perfectly still, trying desperately to appear brave although tears rolled freely down his face. Outside, rain finally began extinguishing the last flames consuming the western wing. Inside, another fire still burned. Adrian's conscience. Dr. Aldrich entered the Duke's chamber slowly. No servants accompanied him. No children followed. He closed the door behind him. "You have seen enough," he whispered. Adrian's fingers twitched almost imperceptibly. "The woman you doubted has risked everything for your children." Silence answered. The physician stepped closer. "If you continue this deception now, you will no longer be testing hearts. You will be breaking them." His footsteps faded as he departed once more. Adrian stared into darkness beneath closed eyelids. Every cruel word he had spoken returned with unbearable clarity. Temporary help. Do not become attached. She will leave. Instead, she had endured humiliation, hunger, loneliness, and finally fire without asking anything in return. Not once had she defended herself. Not once had she abandoned his children. Because of Catherine. Because of a promise. Because love demanded sacrifice. The walls inside him finally shattered. Slowly, painfully, Adrian opened his eyes. For the first time in weeks he saw the carved ceiling above his bed, the dying candles beside him, and the empty chamber surrounding him. His body felt weak from endless stillness, yet one thought overwhelmed every ache. Eleanor. He pushed trembling hands against the mattress. His legs barely supported him as he stood. Each uncertain step toward the adjoining room felt like walking through years of regret. Beyond the partially open door he heard soft sobbing. Henry's broken voice pierced the silence. "Papa, please wake up." Then came Clara's whisper, fragile as falling snow. "We already lost Mama." Another pause followed before Henry's tiny voice cracked completely. "Please, don't let Mama leave us too." Those words struck Adrian harder than any storm, any fire, or any punishment fate could have imagined. Tears blurred his vision as he crossed the threshold at last, no longer a duke protecting his pride, but a broken father running toward the woman whose faithful heart had quietly become the only home his children had left. The room fell into stunned silence as Adrian Ashcombe stepped across the threshold. Weeks of stillness had left him pale and unsteady, yet nothing could disguise the anguish carved into his face. Every servant froze where they stood. Dr. Aldridge lowered his eyes with quiet relief. Lady Beatrice stumbled backward, her carefully maintained composure shattering beneath the impossible sight before her. Only the children moved. Henry threw himself toward his father with a cry that echoed through the chamber, while Clara clung to Adrian's trembling arm. Edmund remained rooted to the floor for one heartbeat before rushing forward as well, unable to believe the miracle unfolding before his eyes. Adrian embraced them with desperate strength, tears slipping freely down his face for the first time since Catherine's funeral. "I'm here," he whispered repeatedly. "I'm here." Yet even while holding his children, his eyes never left Eleanor. She lay motionless upon the neighboring bed, her breathing shallow, soot-still darkening strands of chestnut hair despite the physician's efforts. Bandages wrapped her burned hands and shoulder. Her face looked almost translucent against the white pillow. Adrian slowly approached her bedside. Every step carried the weight of another regret. He knelt beside her exactly where she had knelt beside him for endless nights. Taking her injured hand with extraordinary care, he bowed his head. "I have asked everyone in this house to prove themselves," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "Only now do I understand that I was the one who failed every test." No one spoke. The only sound came from rain dripping outside the windows. Adrian continued. "I believed kindness always hid ambition. I believed affection could be measured by hardship. I believed suspicion protected my family." His fingers tightened gently around hers. "You endured humiliation without bitterness. You accepted loneliness without complaint. You protected my children even when I gave you every reason to leave." His shoulders trembled. "I cannot ask forgiveness. I have not earned it." A soft movement interrupted the silence. Eleanor's fingers twitched faintly within his hand. Dr. Aldridge leaned closer. Another moment passed. Then slowly, very slowly, Eleanor opened her eyes. The first face she saw was Adrian kneeling beside her with tears streaming down his cheeks. Confusion flickered across her expression before realization slowly dawned. "You," she whispered weakly. "I'm awake." She stared at him in disbelief. "You heard everything? Every prayer? Every story? Every one? My promise." His eyes closed briefly. "Especially your promise." A quiet sadness settled between them. Neither spoke for several moments. Words suddenly seemed too small for everything that had been discovered. Finally Eleanor tried to sit upright. Pain forced her back onto the pillows. "You should have remained in bed," she murmured. Adrian almost laughed through his tears. "You are still worrying about me." She looked toward the children first. Not toward him. "Are they safe?" Henry climbed carefully onto the edge of her bed. "We're safe because of you." Clara wrapped both arms around Eleanor as gently as possible. "We thought we lost you." Eleanor kissed the little girl's forehead. "You never will." Those simple words broke whatever restraint remained inside the room. Servants openly wiped away tears. Even hardened footmen turned their faces aside. For the first time since Catherine's death, Ashcombe Manor no longer felt like a house haunted by grief. It felt like a family refusing to lose one another again. The peace lasted only moments. Lady Beatrice suddenly stepped forward. "This changes nothing," she declared sharply. "The Duke deceived everyone. The household requires proper leadership. A governess cannot simply become." "Enough." Adrian's voice cut through the room with calm authority. He slowly rose despite obvious weakness. Every eye followed him. "I remained silent because I wished to discover the character of those around my children." He turned toward Lady Beatrice. "I discovered yours." Her confident smile vanished. "You frightened innocent children. You stripped loyal servants of their dignity. You attempted to drive away the woman my late wife trusted above everyone else." She opened her mouth to protest. Adrian raised one hand. No. For the first time in years, his authority carried neither pride nor anger. Only certainty. "You are no longer welcome at Ashcombe Manor." Several servants exchanged astonished glances. Lady Beatrice stared at him in disbelief. "You would choose a governess over your own family?" He answered without hesitation. "My family made that choice long before I did." He looked toward Eleanor and the children. There they stand. Lady Beatrice's expression hardened. Without another word she gathered her gloves, lifted her chin and walked through the chamber. No servant attempted to stop her. No child looked back. When the front doors finally closed behind her carriage, it felt as though years of bitterness departed with her. Recovery came slowly. Weeks turned into months as spring surrendered to early summer. The burned nursery was rebuilt. Dismissed servants returned to their rightful positions, welcomed with heartfelt apologies from their Duke himself. Every elderly servant whose wages had been restored by Eleanor discovered anonymous gifts waiting in their rooms. Only later did they learn the gifts came directly from Adrian. Not as charity, as gratitude. He changed as surely as the seasons. The man who once walked through corridors without seeing anyone now learned every servant's name. He attended lessons with his children. He laughed again. Sometimes awkwardly. Sometimes quietly. Always sincerely. Every evening the family gathered in the music room. Henry proudly played Catherine's rescued music box. Clara practiced the piano beside Eleanor. Edmund read aloud from history books while Adrian simply listened, grateful for sounds that once seemed ordinary. One afternoon Adrian asked Dr. Aldrich for the silver key Catherine had entrusted to Eleanor years earlier. The physician smiled knowingly before retrieving it from the oak box. Adrian carried it himself into the rose garden where Eleanor sat beneath blooming white blossoms. "I finally understand," he said softly. She looked down at the tiny silver key. "I never knew what it opened. It opened my heart." She lowered her eyes, overcome by emotion. "I failed Catherine." "No." Adrian gently shook his head. "I failed her." Silence settled comfortably between them. Birdsong drifted across the gardens while warm sunlight illuminated thousands of white roses Catherine had planted herself. Adrian reached into his coat and unfolded the final page of Catherine's letter. "I asked Dr. Aldrich for permission to finish reading it." Eleanor looked surprised. "There was another sentence beneath the one you saw." He smiled through gathering tears. "It simply says, 'If my husband ever remembers how to love again, tell him I never stopped believing he would.'" Neither noticed the children watching from a nearby garden path. Edmund smiled knowingly. Henry squeezed Clara's hand excitedly. Without waiting for permission, all three raced toward them. Henry climbed onto Adrian's lap. Clara hugged Eleanor. Edmund stood proudly beside them. Adrian looked around at the four people surrounding him. "I spent weeks pretending to sleep so I could discover who truly loved my family." He turned toward Eleanor. "But while my eyes were closed, you quietly became the heart that held us together." Slowly, before his children, his servants, Dr. Aldrich, and every soul gathered in the blooming gardens, the Duke of Ashcombe lowered himself onto one knee. Not as England's proud nobleman. Simply as a grateful man. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, his voice steady despite the tears shining in his eyes, "my children no longer need a governess because they already have someone they trust with all their hearts. I no longer seek someone to care for this house because you have already given it life again. I ask only one thing." He gently took both of her hands. "Stay." Not because of a promise you made to Catherine, but because we have already become your family. Will you allow me to spend the rest of my life proving that your faith in us was never misplaced? Tears streamed down Eleanor's cheeks as she looked from Adrian to the three hopeful children waiting breathlessly beside him. Then she smiled. A smile Catherine herself would have recognized. "Yes," she whispered. Before anyone else could speak, Henry shouted with all the joy his little heart could hold. "Mama is staying." Laughter, tears, and applause filled the rose garden together as church bells from the nearby village began ringing across the valley. 1 year later, during the next spring charity ball, the rebuilt Ashcombe Manor glowed brighter than ever before. Beneath hundreds of candlelit chandeliers, Adrian and Eleanor shared the opening dance while Edmund, Clara, and Henry laughed nearby, surrounded by servants who were no longer merely employees but cherished members of one united household. Above the grand staircase hung a single framed sentence written in Catherine's graceful hand: "The greatest inheritance is not a title, but the heart that chooses to stay." And at last, every soul beneath that roof understood those words were the truest legacy the House of Ashcombe would ever possess.